Section 40 of The Queen of Hearts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Smith Nash. Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Queen of Hearts by Wilkie Collins. Section 40. Brother Owen's Story of Anne Rodway. Part 2. April 30th. I have found it. God knows to what results it may lead, but it is as certain as that I am sitting here before my journal that I have found the cravat from which the end in Mary's hand was torn. I discovered it last night, but the flutter I was in, and the nervousness and uncertainty I felt, prevented me from noting down this most extraordinary and unexpected event at the time when it happened. Let me try if I can preserve the memory of it in writing now. I was going home rather late from work, when I suddenly remembered that I had forgotten to buy myself any candles the evening before, and that I should be left in the dark if I did not manage to rectify this mistake in some way. The shop close to me, at which I usually deal, would be shut up, I knew, before I could get to it, so I determined to go into the first place I passed where candles were sold. This turned out to be a small shop with 2 counters, which did business on one side in the general grocery way, and on the other side in the rag and bottle and old iron line. There were several customers on the grocery side when I went in, so I waited on the empty rag side till I could be served. Glancing about me here at the worthless-looking things by which I was surrounded, my eye was caught by a bundle of rags lying on the counter, as if they had just been brought in and left there. From mere idle curiosity, I looked close at the rags, and saw among them something like an old cravat. I took it up directly, and held it under a gaslight. The pattern was blurred lilac lines running across and across the dingy black ground in a trellis-work form. I looked at the ends. One of them was torn off. How I managed to hide the breathless surprise into which this discovery threw me, I cannot say, but I certainly contrived to steady my voice somehow, and to ask for my candles calmly, when the man and woman serving in the shop, having disposed of their other customers, inquired of me what I wanted. As the man took down the candles, my brain was all in a whirl with trying to think how I could get possession of the old cravat without exciting any suspicion. Chance, and a little quickness on my part in taking advantage of it, put the object within my reach in a moment. The man, having counted out the candles, asked the woman for some paper to wrap them in. She produced a piece much too small and flimsy for the purpose, and declared, when he called for something better, that the day's supply of stout paper was all exhausted. He flew into a rage with her for managing so badly. Just as they were beginning to quarrel violently, I stepped back to the rag counter, and took the old cravat carelessly out of the bundle, and said, in as light a tone as I could possibly assume, "Come, don't let my candles be the cause of hard words between you. Tie this ragged old thing round them with a piece of string, and I shall carry them home quite comfortably." The man seemed disposed to insist on the stout paper being produced, but the woman, as if she was glad of an opportunity of spiting him, snatched the candles away, and tied them up in a moment in the torn old cravat. I was afraid he would have struck her before my face, he seemed in such a fury, but, fortunately, another customer came in and obliged him to put his hands to peaceable and proper use. "Quite a bundle of all sorts on the opposite counter there," I said to the woman as I paid her for the candles. "Yes, and all hoarded up for sale by a poor creature with a lazy brute of a husband, who lets his wife do all the work while he spends all the money," answered the woman with a malicious look at the man by her side. "He can't surely have much money to spend, if his wife has no better work to do than picking up rags," said I. "It isn't her fault if she hasn't got no better," says the woman rather angrily. "She's ready to turn her hand to anything. Charing, washing, laying out, keeping empty houses, nothing comes amiss to her. She's my half sister, and I think I ought to know." "Did you say she went out charing?" I asked, making believe as if I knew of somebody who might employ her. "Yes, of course I did," answered the woman. "And if you can put a job into her hands, you'll be doing a good turn to a poor hard-working creature as she wants it. She lives down the mews here to the right, name of Horlick, and as honest a woman as ever stood in shoe-leather. Now then, ma'am, what for you?" Another customer came in just then, and occupied her attention. I left the shop, passed the turning that led down to the mews, looked up at the name of the street so as to know how to find it again, and then ran home as fast as I could. Perhaps it was the remembrance of my strange dream striking me on a sudden, or perhaps it was the shock of the discovery I had just made, but I began to feel frightened without knowing why, and anxious to be under shelter in my own room. If Robert should come back! Oh, what a relief and help it would be now if Robert should come back! May 1st. On getting indoors last night, the first thing I did after striking a light was to take the ragged cravat off the candles and smooth it out on the table. I then took the end that had been in poor Mary's hand out of my writing desk, and smoothed that out too. It matched the torn side of the cravat exactly. I put them together, and satisfied myself that there was not a doubt of it. Not once did I close my eyes that night. A kind of fever got possession of me, a vehement yearning to go on from this first discovery, and to find out more, no matter what the risk might be. The cravat now really became to my mind the clue that I thought I saw in my dream, the clue that I was resolved to follow. I determined to go to Mrs. Horlick this evening on my return from work. I found the mews easily. A crook-backed dwarf of a man was lounging at the corner of it, smoking his pipe. Not liking his looks, I did not inquire of him where Mrs. Horlick lived, but went down the mews till I met with a woman and asked her. She directed me to the right number. I knocked at the door, and Mrs. Horlick herself, a lean, ill-tempered, miserable-looking woman, answered it. I told her at once that I had come to ask what her terms were for charing. She stared at me for a moment, then answered my question civilly enough. "You look surprised at a stranger like me finding you out," I said. "I first came to hear of you last night, from a relation of yours, in rather an odd way." And I told her all that had happened in the chandler's shop, bringing in the bundles of rags, and the circumstance of my carrying home the candles in the old torn cravat, as often as possible. "It's the first time I've heard of anything belonging to him turning out to any use," said Mrs. Horlick bitterly. "What? The spoiled old neck handkerchief belonged to your husband, did it?" said I at a venture. "Yes. I pitched his rotten rag of a neck-handkercher into the bundle along with the rest, and I wish I could have pitched him in after it," said Mrs. Horlick. "I'd sell him cheap at any rag shop. There he stands, smoking his pipe at the end of the mews, out of work for weeks past, the idlest, hump-backed pig in all of London." She pointed to the man whom I had passed on entering the mews. My cheeks began to burn, and my knees to tremble, for I knew that in tracing the cravat to its owner, I was advancing a step toward a fresh discovery. I wished Mrs. Horlick good evening, and said I would write and mention the day on which I wanted her. What I had just been told put a thought into my mind that I was afraid to follow out. I have heard people talk of being light-headed, and I felt as I have heard them say they felt when I retraced my steps up the mews. My head got giddy, and my eyes seemed able to see nothing but the figure of the little crook-backed man, still smoking his pipe in his former place. I could think of nothing but the mark of the blow on my poor lost Mary's temple. I know that I must have been light-headed, for as I came close to the crook-backed man, I stopped without meaning it. The minute before, there had been no idea in me of speaking to him. I did not know how to speak, or in what way it would be safest to begin, and yet the moment I came face to face with him, something out of myself seemed to stop me, and to make me speak without considering beforehand, without thinking of consequences, without knowing, I may almost say, what words I was uttering, till the instant when they rose to my lips. "When your old necktie was torn, did you know that one end of it went to the rag shop, and the other fell into my hands?" I said these bold words to him suddenly, and, as it seemed, without my own will taking any part in them. He started, stared, changed colour. He was too much amazed by my sudden speaking to find an answer for me. When he did open his lips, it was to say rather to himself than to me, "You're not the girl." "No," I said, with a strange choking at my heart. "I'm her friend." By this time he had recovered his surprise, and he seemed to be aware that he had let out more than he ought. "You might be anybody's friend you like," he said brutally, "so long as you don't come jabbering nonsense here. I don't know you, and I don't understand your jokes." He turned quickly away from me when he had said the last words. He had never once looked fairly at me since I first spoke to him. Was it his hand that had struck the blow? I had only sixpence in my pocket, but I took it out and followed him. If it had been a £5 note, I should have done the same in the state I was in. "Would a pot of beer help you to understand me?" I said, and I offered him the sixpence. "A pot ain't no great things," he answered, taking the sixpence doubtfully. "It might lead to something better," I said. His eyes began to twinkle, and he came close to me. Oh, how my legs trembled, how my head swam! "This is all in a friendly way, is it?" he asked in a whisper. I nodded my head. At the moment, I could not have spoken for worlds. "Friendly, of course," he went on to himself, "or there would have been a policeman in it. She told you, I suppose, that I wasn't the man." I nodded my head again. It was all I could do to keep myself standing upright. "I suppose it's a case of threatening to have him up, and make him settle it quietly for £1 or 2. How much for me if you lay hold of him?" "Half." I began to be afraid that he would suspect something if I was still silent. The wretch's eyes twinkled again, and he came yet closer. "I drove him to the Red Lion, corner of Dodd Street and Rudgley Street. The house was shut up, but he was let in at the jug and bottle door, like a man who is known to the landlord. That's as much as I can tell you. I'm certain I'm right. He was the last fare I took up at night. The next morning master gave me the sack. Said I cribbed his corn and his fares. I wish I had." I gathered from this that the crook-backed man had been a cab driver. "Why don't you speak?" he asked suspiciously. "Has she been telling you a pack of lies about me? What did she say when she came home?" "What ought she to have said?" "She ought to have said my fare was drunk, and she came in the way as he was going to get into the cab. That's what she ought to have said to begin with." "But after?" "Well, after my fare, by way of larking with her, puts out his leg for to trip her up, and she stumbles and catches at me for to save herself, and tears off one of the limp ends of my rotten old tie. 'What do you mean by that, you brute?' she says, turning round as soon as she was steady on her legs to my fare. Says my fare to her, 'I means to teach you to keep a civil tongue in your head.' And he ups with his fist. And what's come to you now? What are you looking at me like that for? How do you think a man of my size was to take her part against a man big enough to have eaten me up? Look as much as you like. In my place, you would have done what I done. Drew off when he shook his fist at you. And I swore he'd be the death of you if you didn't start your horse in no time. I saw he was working himself up into a rage, but I could not, if my life had depended on it, have stood near him and looked at him any longer. I just managed to stammer out that I had been walking a long way, and that, not being used to much exercise, I felt faint and giddy with fatigue. He only changed from angry to sulky when I made that excuse. I got a little farther away from him, and then added that he would be at the Mews entrance the next evening. If he would be at the Mews entrance the next evening, I should have something more to say and something more to give him. He grumbled a few suspicious words in answer about doubting whether he should trust me to come back. Fortunately, at that moment, a policeman passed on the opposite side of the way. He slunk down the Mews immediately, and I was free to make my escape. How I got home I can't say, except to think I ran the greater part of the way. Sally opened the door and asked if anything was the matter the moment she saw my face. I answered, "Nothing, nothing." She stopped me as I was going into my room and said, "Smooth your hair a bit and put your collar straight. There's a gentleman in there waiting for you." My heart gave one great bound. I knew who it was in an instant, and rushed into the room like a madwoman. "Oh, Robert! Robert!" All my heart went out to him in those two little words. "Good God, Anne! Has anything happened? Are you ill?" "Mary! My poor, lost, murdered, dear, dear Mary!" That was all I could say before I fell on his breast. May 2nd. Misfortunes and disappointments have saddened him a little. But towards me he is unaltered. He is as good, as kind, as gently and truly affectionate as ever. I believe no other man in the world could have listened to the story of Mary's death with such tenderness and pity as he. Instead of cutting me short anywhere, he drew me on to tell more than I had intended, and his first generous words, when I had done, were to assure me that he would see himself to the grass being laid and the flowers planted on Mary's grave. I could almost have gone on my knees and worshipped him when he made me that promise. Surely this best and kindest and noblest of men cannot always be unfortunate. My cheeks burn when I think that he has come back with only a few pounds in his pocket, after all his hard and honest struggles to do well in America. They must be bad people there, when such a man as Robert cannot get on among them. He now talks calmly and resignedly of trying for any one of the lowest employments by which a man can earn his bread honestly in this great city. He who knows French, who can write so beautifully. Oh, if the people who have places to give away only knew Robert as well as I do! What a salary he would have, what a post he would be chosen to occupy. I am writing these lines alone, while he has gone to the Mews to treat with the dastardly, heartless wretch with whom I spoke yesterday. Robert says the creature, I won't call him a man, must be humoured and kept deceived about poor Mary's end, in order that we may discover and bring to justice the monster whose drunken blow was the death of her. I shall know no ease of mind till her murderer is secured, and till I am certain that he will be made to suffer for his crimes. I wanted to go with Robert to the Mews, but he said it was best that he should carry out the rest of the investigation alone, for my strength and resolution have been too hardly taxed already. He said more words in praise of me for what I have been able to do up to this time, which I am almost ashamed to write down with my own pen. Besides, there is no need. Praise from his lips is one of the things that I can trust my memory to preserve to the latest day of my life. May 3rd. Robert was very long last night before he came back to tell me what he had done. He easily recognized the hunchback at the corner of the Mews by my description of him, but he found it a harder time, even with the help of money, to overcome the cowardly wretch's distrust of him as a stranger and a man. However, when this had been accomplished, the main difficulty was conquered. The hunchback, excited by the promise of more money, went at once to the Red Lion to inquire about the person whom he had driven there in his cab. Robert followed him and waited at the corner of the street. The tidings brought by the cabman were of the most unexpected kind. The murderer, I can write of him by no other name, had fallen ill on the very night when he was driven to the Red Lion, and had taken to his bed there and then, and was still confined to it at that very moment. His disease was of a kind that is brought on by excessive drinking, and that affects the mind as well as the body. The people at the public house call it the horrors. Hearing these things, Robert determined to see if he could not find out something more for himself by going and inquiring at the public house in the character of one of the friends of the sick man in bed upstairs. He made 2 important discoveries. First, he found out the name and address of the doctor in attendance. Secondly, he entrapped the barman into mentioning the murderous wretch by his name. This last discovery adds an unspeakably fearful interest to the dreadful misfortune of Mary's death. Noah Truscott, as she told me herself in the last conversation I ever had with her, was the name of the man whose drunken example ruined her father and Noah Truscott is also the name of the man whose drunken fury killed her. There is something that makes one shudder, something supernatural in this awful fact. Robert agrees with me that the hand of Providence must have guided my steps to that shop from which all the discoveries since made took their rise. He says he believes that we are the instruments of effecting a righteous retribution, and if he spends his last farthing, he will have the investigation brought to its full end in a court of justice. May 4th. Robert went today to consult a lawyer whom he knew in former times. The lawyer was much interested, though not so seriously impressed as he ought to have been by the story of Mary's death and of the events that have followed it. He gave Robert a confidential letter to take to the doctor in attendance on the double-dyed villain at the Red Lion. Robert left the letter, and called again and saw the doctor, who said his patient was getting better, and would most likely be up again in 10 days or a fortnight. This statement Robert communicated to the lawyer, and the lawyer has undertaken to have the public-house properly watched, and the hunchback, who is the most important witness, sharply looked after for the next fortnight, or longer if necessary. Here, then, the progress of this dreadful business stops for a while. May 5th. Robert has got a little temporary employment in copying for his friend the lawyer. I am working harder than ever at my needle to make up for the time that has been lost lately. May 6th. Today was Sunday, and Robert proposed that we should go and look at Mary's grave. He who forgets nothing where a kindness is to be done has found time to perform the promise he made to me on the night when we first met. The grave is already, by his orders, covered with turf and planted round with shrubs. Some flowers and a low headstone are to be added, to make the place look worthier of my poor lost darling who is beneath it. Oh, I hope I shall live long after I'm married to Robert. I want so much time to show him all my gratitude. May 20th. A hard trial to my courage today. I have given evidence at the police office, and I have seen the monster who murdered her. I could only look at him once. I could just see that he was a giant in size, and that he kept his dull, lowering, bestial face turned toward the witness box, and his bloodshot, vacant eyes staring on me. For an instant I tried to confront that look. For an instant I kept my attention fixed on him, on his blotched face, on the short, grizzled hair above it, on his knotty, murderous right hand hanging loose over the bar in front of him, like the paw of a wild beast over the edge of its den. Then the horror of him, the double horror of confronting him in the first place, and afterward of seeing that he was an old man, overcame me, and I turned away, faint, sick, and shuddering. I never faced him again, and at the end of my evidence, Robert considerately took me out. When we met once more at the end of the examination, Robert told me that the prisoner never spoke and never changed his position. He was either fortified by the cruel composure of a savage, or his faculties had not yet thoroughly recovered from the disease that had so lately shaken them. The magistrate seemed to doubt if he was in his right mind, but the evidence of the medical man relieved this uncertainty, and the prisoner was committed for trial on a charge of manslaughter. Why not a charge of murder? Robert explained the law to me when I asked that question. I accepted the explanation, but it did not satisfy me. Mary Mallinson was killed by a blow from the hand of Noah Truscott. That is murder in the sight of God. Why not murder in the sight of the law also? End of section 40. Section 41 of The Queen of Hearts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Queen of Hearts by Wilkie Collins. Section 41. Brother Owen's Story of Anne Rodway, Part 3. June 18th. Tomorrow is the day appointed for the trial at the Old Bailey. Before sunset this evening I went to look at Mary's grave. The turf has grown so green since I saw it last, and the flowers are springing up so prettily. A bird was perched, dressing his feathers on the low white headstone that bears the inscription of her name and age. I did not go near enough to disturb the little creature. He looked innocent and pretty on the grave, as Mary herself was in her lifetime. When he flew away, I went and sat for a little by the headstone, and read the mournful lines on it. Oh, my love, my love! What harm or wrong had you ever done in this world that you should die at 18 by a blow from a drunkard's hand? June 19th. The trial. My experience of what happened at it is limited, like my experience of the examination at the police office, to the time occupied in giving my own evidence. They made me say much more than I said before the magistrate. Between examination and cross-examination, I had to go into almost all the particulars about poor Mary and her funeral that I have written in this journal, the jury listening to every word I spoke with the most anxious attention. At the end, the judge said a few words to me approving of my conduct, and then there was a clapping of hands among the people in court. I was so agitated and excited that I trembled all over when they let me go out into the air again. I looked at the prisoner both when I entered the witness box and when I left it. The lowering brutality of his face was unchanged, but his faculties seemed to be more alive and observant than they were at the police office. A frightful blue change passed over his face, and he drew his breath so heavily that the gasps were distinctly audible while I mentioned Mary by name and described the mark or the blow on her temple. When they asked me if I knew anything of the prisoner, I answered that I only knew what Mary herself had told me about his having been her father's ruin. He gave a kind of groan and struck both his hands heavily on the dock, and when I passed beneath him on my way out of court, he leaned over suddenly. Whether to speak to me or to strike me I can't say, for he was immediately made to stand upright by the turnkeys on either side of him. While the evidence proceeded, as Robert described it to me, the signs that he was suffering under superstitious terror became more and more apparent, until at last, just as the lawyer appointed to defend him was rising to speak, he suddenly cried out in a voice that startled everyone, up to the very judge on the bench, "Stop!" There was a pause, and all eyes looked at him. The perspiration was pouring over his face like water, and he made strange, uncouth signs with his hands to the judge opposite. "Stop all this," he cried again. "I've been the ruin of the father and the death of the child. Hang me before I do more harm. Hang me, for God's sake, out of the way." As soon as the shock produced by this extraordinary interruption had subsided, he was removed, and there followed a long discussion about whether he was of sound mind or not. The matter was left to the jury to decide by their verdict. They found him guilty of the charge of manslaughter, without the excuse of insanity. He was brought up again and condemned to transportation for life. All he did on hearing the dreadful sentence was to reiterate his desperate words, "Hang me before I do more harm. Hang me, for God's sake, out of the way." June 20th. I made yesterday's entry in sadness of heart, and I have not been better in my spirits today. It is something to have brought the murderer to the punishment that he deserves, but the knowledge that this most righteous act of retribution is accomplished brings no consolation with it. The law does indeed punish Noah Truscott for his crime, but can it raise up Mary Mallinson from her last resting place in the churchyard? While writing of the law, I ought to record that the heartless wretch who allowed Mary to be struck down in his presence without making an attempt to defend her is not likely to escape with perfect impunity. The policeman who looked after him to ensure his attendance at the trial discovered that he had committed past offences for which the law can make him answer. A summons was executed upon him, and he was taken before the magistrate the moment he left the court after giving his evidence. I had just written these few lines, and was closing my journal, when there came a knock at the door. I answered it, thinking that Robert had called on his way home to say good night, and found myself face to face with a strange gentleman, who immediately asked for Anne Rodway. On hearing that I was the person inquired for, he requested 5 minutes' conversation with me. I showed him into the little empty room at the back of the house, and waited, rather surprised and fluttered, to hear what he had to say. He was a dark man, with a serious manner and a short, stern way of speaking. I was certain that he was a stranger, and yet there seemed something in his face not unfamiliar to me. He began by taking a newspaper from his pocket and asking me if I was the person who had given evidence at the trial of Noah Truscott on the charge of manslaughter. I answered immediately that I was. "I have been for nearly 2 years in London, seeking Mary Mallinson, and always seeking her in vain," he said. "The first and only news I have had of her I found in the newspaper report of the trial yesterday." He spoke calmly, but there was something in the look of his eyes which showed me that he was suffering in spirit. A certain nervousness overcame me, and I was obliged to sit down. "You knew Mary Mallinson, sir?" I asked, as quietly as I could. "I am her brother." I clasped my hands and hid my face in despair. Oh, the bitterness of heart with which I heard him say those simple words! "You were very kind to her," said the calm, tearless man. "In her name, and for her sake, I thank you." "Oh, sir," I said, "why did you never write to her when you were in foreign parts?" I wrote often, he answered, but each of my letters contained a remittance of money. Did Mary tell you that she had a stepmother? If she did, you may guess why none of my letters were allowed to reach her. I now know that this woman robbed my sister. Has she lied in telling me that she was never informed of Mary's place of abode? I remember that Mary had never communicated with her stepmother after the separation, and could therefore assure him that the woman had spoken the truth. He paused for a moment after that and sighed. Then he took out a pocket-book and said, I have already arranged for the payment of any legal expenses that may have been incurred by the trial, but I have still to reimburse you for the funeral charges, which you so generously defrayed. Excuse my speaking bluntly on this subject. I am accustomed to look on all matters where money is concerned purely as matters of business. I saw that he was taking several bank notes out of the pocket-book, and stopped him. I will gratefully receive back the little money I actually paid, sir, because I am not well off, and it would be an ungracious act of pride in me to refuse it from you, I said. But I see you handling bank notes, any one of which is far beyond the amount you have to repay me. Pray put them back, sir. What I did for your poor lost sister, I did from my love and fondness for her. You have thanked me for that, and your thanks are all I can receive. He had hitherto concealed his feelings, but I saw them now begin to get the better of him. His eye softened, and he took my hand and squeezed it hard. I beg your pardon, with all my heart. There was silence between us, for I was crying, and I believe at heart he was crying too. At last he dropped my hand, and seemed to change back by an effort to his former calmness. Is there no one belonging to you to whom I can be of service? He asked. I see among the witnesses on the trial the name of a young man who appears to have assisted you in the inquiries which led to the prisoner's conviction. Is he a relation? No, sir. At least not now. But I hope. What? I hope that he may, one day, be the nearest and dearest relation to me that a woman can have. I said those words boldly, because I was afraid of his otherwise taking some wrong view of the connection between Robert and me. One day, he repeated. One day may be a long time hence. We are neither of us well off, sir, I said. One day means the day when we are a little richer than we are now. Is the young man educated? Can he produce testimonials to his character? Oblige me by writing his name and address down on the back of that card. When I had obeyed, in a handwriting which I am afraid did me no credit, he took out another card and gave it to me. I shall leave England tomorrow, he said. There is nothing now to keep me in my own country. If you are ever in any difficulty or distress, which I pray God you may never be, apply to my London agent, whose address you have here. He stopped and looked at me attentively, then took my hand again. Where is she buried? He said suddenly, in a quick whisper, turning his head away. I told him, and added that we had made the grave as beautiful as we could with grass and flowers. I saw his lips whiten and tremble. "God bless and reward you," he said, and drew me toward him quickly and kissed my forehead. I was quite overcome, and sank down and hid my face on the table. When I looked up again, he was gone. End of section 41. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Section 42 of The Queen of Hearts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Queen of Hearts by Wilkie Collins. Section 42. Brother Owen's Story of Anne Rodway, Part 4. June 25th, 1841. I write these lines on my wedding morning, when little more than a year has passed since Robert returned to England. His salary was increased yesterday to £150 a year. If only I knew where Mr. Mallinson was, I would write and tell him of our present happiness. But for the situation which his kindness procured for Robert, we might still have been waiting vainly for the day that has now come. I am to work at home for the future, and Sally is to help us in our new abode. If Mary could have lived to see this day! I am not ungrateful for my blessings, but oh, how I miss that sweet face on this morning of all others. I got up to-day early enough to go alone to the grave, and to gather the nosegay that now lies before me from the flowers that grow round it. I shall put it in my bosom when Robert comes to fetch me to the church. Mary would have been my bridesmaid if she had lived, and I can't forget Mary even on my wedding day. The night. The last words of the last story fell low and trembling from Owen's lips. He waited for a moment while Jessie dried the tears which Anne Rodway's simple diary had drawn from her warm young heart, then closed the manuscript, and taking her hand, patted it in his gentle, fatherly way. "You will be glad to hear, my love," he said, "that I can speak from personal experience of Anne Rodway's happiness. She came to live in my parish soon after the trial at which she appeared as chief witness, and I was the clergyman who married her. Months before that I knew her story, and had read those portions of her diary which you have just heard. When I made her my little present on her wedding day, and when she gratefully entreated me to tell her what she could do for me in return, I asked for a copy of her diary to keep among the papers that I treasured most. The reading of it now and then, I said, will encourage that faith in the brighter and better part of human nature, which I hope, by God's help, to preserve pure to my dying day. And in that way I became possessed of the manuscript. It was Anne's husband who made the copy for me. You have noticed a few withered leaves scattered here and there between the pages. They were put there years since, by the bride's own hand. They are all that now remain of the flowers that Anne Rodway gathered on her marriage morning from Mary Mallinson's grave. Jessie tried to answer, but the words failed on her lips. Between the effect of the story and the anticipation of the parting now so near at hand, the good, impulsive, affectionate creature was fairly overcome. She laid her head on Owen's shoulder and kept tight hold of his hand, and let her heart speak simply for itself, without attempting to help it by a single word. The silence that followed was broken harshly by the tower clock. The heavy hammer slowly rang out 10 strokes through the gloomy night time and the dying storm. I waited till the last humming echo of the clock fainted into dead stillness. I listened once more attentively, and again listened in vain. Then I rose and proposed to my brothers that we should leave our guest to compose herself for the night. When Owen and Morgan were ready to quit the room, I took her by the hand and drew her a little aside. "You leave us early, my dear," I said. "But before you go tomorrow morning—" I stopped to listen for the last time, before the words were spoken which committed me to the desperate experiment of pleading George's cause in defiance of his own request. Nothing caught my ear but the sweep of the weary, weakened wind and the melancholy surging of the shaken trees. "But before you go tomorrow morning," I resumed, "I want to speak to you in private. We shall breakfast at 8 o'clock. Is it asking too much to beg you to come and see me alone in my study at 7:30?" Just as her lips opened to answer me, I saw a change pass over her face. I had kept her hand in mine while I was speaking, and I must have pressed it unconsciously so hard as almost to hurt her. She may even have uttered a few words of remonstrance, but they never reached me. My whole hearing sense was seized, absorbed, petrified. At the very instant when I had ceased speaking, I, and I alone, heard a faint sound, a sound that was new to me, fly past the Glen Tower on the wings of the wind. "Open the window, for God's sake!" I cried. My hand mechanically held hers tighter and tighter. She struggled to free it, looking hard at me with pale cheeks and frightened eyes. Owen hastened up and released her, and put his arms round me. "Griffith, Griffith," he whispered, "control yourself, for George's sake." Morgan hurried to the window and threw it open. The wind and rain rushed in fiercely. Welcome, welcome wind! They all heard it now. Oh, Father in heaven, so merciful to fathers on earth, my son, my son! It came in louder and louder with every gust of wind, the joyous, rapid, gathering roll of wheels. My eyes fastened on her as if they could see to her heart, while she stood there with her sweet face turned on me all pale and startled. I tried to speak to her. I tried to break away from Owen's arms, to throw my own arms round her, to keep her on my bosom till he came to take her from me. But all my strength had gone in the long waiting and the long suspense. My head sank on Owen's breast, but still I heard the wheels. Morgan loosened my cravat and sprinkled water over my face. I still heard the wheels. The poor terrified girl ran into her room and came back with her smelling salts. I heard the carriage stop at the house. The room whirled round and round with me, but I heard the eager hurry of footsteps in the hall, and the opening of the door. In another moment my son's voice rose clear and cheerful from below, greeting the old servants who loved him. The dear familiar tones just poured into my ear, and then, the moment they filled it, hushed me suddenly to rest. When I came to myself again, my eyes opened upon George. I was lying on the sofa, still in the same room. The lights we had read by in the evening were burning on the table. My son was kneeling at my pillow, and we, too, were alone. The morning. The wind is fainter, but there is still no calm. The rain is ceasing, but there is still no sunshine. The view from my window shows me the mist heavy on the earth, and a dim grey veil drawn darkly over the sky. Less than 12 hours since, such a prospect would have saddened me for the day. I look out at it this morning through the bright medium of my own happiness, and not the shadow of a shade falls across the steady inner sunshine that is pouring over my heart. The pen lingers fondly in my hand, yet it is little, very little, that I have left to say. The purple volume lies open by my side, with the stories ranged together in it, in the order in which they were read. My son has learned to prize them already as the faithful friends who served him at his utmost need. I have only to wind off the little thread of narrative on which they are all strung together before the volume is closed, and our anxious literary experiment fairly ended. My son and I had a quiet hour together on that happy night before we retired to rest. The little love plot invented in George's interests now required one last stroke of diplomacy to complete it, before we all threw off our masks and assumed our true characters for the future. When my son and I parted for the night, we had planned the necessary stratagem for taking our lovely guest by surprise as soon as she was out of her bed in the morning. Shortly after 7 o'clock, I sent a message to Jessie by her maid, informing her that a good night's rest had done wonders for me, and that I expected to see her in my study at 7:30, as we had arranged the evening before. As soon as her answer, promising to be punctual to the appointment, had reached me, I took George into my study, left him in my place to plead his own cause, and stole away, 5 minutes before the half hour, to join my brothers in the breakfast room. Although the sense of my own happiness disposed me to take the brightest view of my son's chances, I must nevertheless acknowledge that some nervous anxiety still fluttered about my heart, while the slow minutes of suspense were counting themselves out in the breakfast room. I had as little attention to spare for Owen's quiet prognostications of success as for Morgan's pitiless sarcasms on love, courtship, and matrimony. A quarter of an hour elapsed, then 20 minutes. The hand moved on, and the clock pointed to 5 minutes to 8, before I heard the study door open, and before the sound of rapidly advancing footsteps warned me that George was coming into the room. His beaming face told the good news before a word could be spoken on either side. The excess of his happiness literally and truly deprived him of speech. He stood eagerly looking at us all three with outstretched hands and glistening eyes. "Have I folded up my surplice forever?" asked Owen. "Or am I to wear it once again, George, in your service?" "Answer this question first," interposed Morgan, with a look of grim anxiety. "Have you actually taken your young woman off my hands, or have you not?" No direct answer followed either question. George's feelings had been too deeply stirred to allow him to return jest for jest at a moment's notice. "Oh, father, how can I thank you?" he said. "And you, he added, looking at Owen and Morgan gratefully. "You must thank chance as well as thank us," I replied, speaking as lightly as my heart would let me, to encourage him. The advantage of numbers in our little love plot was all on our side. Remember, George, we were 3-1. While I was speaking, the breakfast room door opened noiselessly and showed us Jessie standing on the threshold, uncertain whether to join us or to run back to her own room. Her bright complexion heightened to a deep glow, the tears just rising in her eyes, and not yet falling from them, her delicate lips trembling a little, as if they were still shyly conscious of others' lips that had pressed them but a few minutes since, her attitude irresolutely graceful, her hair just disturbed enough over her forehead and her cheeks to add to the charm of them. She stood before us, the loveliest living picture of youth and tenderness and virgin love that eyes have ever looked on. George and I both advanced together to meet her at the door, but the good, grateful girl had heard from my son the true story of all that I had done and hoped and suffered for the last 10 days, and showed charmingly how she felt it by turning at once to me. "May I stop at the Glen Tower a little longer?" she asked simply. "If you think you can get through your evenings, my love," I answered. "But surely you forget that the purple volume is closed, and that the stories have all come to an end?" She clasped her arms round my neck and laid her cheek fondly against mine. "How you must have suffered yesterday," she whispered softly. "And how happy I am to-day." The tears gathered in her eyes and dropped over her cheeks as she raised her head to look at me affectionately when I said those words. I gently unclasped her arms and led her to George. "So you really did love him, then, after all," I whispered, "though you were too sly to let me discover it?" A smile broke out among the tears as her eyes wandered away from mine and stole a look at my son. The clock struck the hour, and the servant came in with breakfast. A little domestic interruption of this kind was all that was wanted to put us at our ease. We drew round the table cheerfully, and set the Queen of Hearts at the head of it, in the character of mistress of the house already. End of section 42. Recording by Susan Smith Nash, Tulsa, Oklahoma. End of The Queen of Hearts by Wilkie Collins.